Bom dia outra vez. Cheios de energia depois do café, com frutas. E obrigado a todos os que nos deram essa comida. Vamos continuar com a quarta plenária. E o tema é a governança, o governo dessa semana. E a transparência no setor público como condição habilitante para a participação no setor privado. Vai ser moderado por Patrícia Mackenzie, especialista do Banco Mundial em gestão financeira. Bom dia. Os panelistas são Andrea Padilha, ela é diretora para Hispano-América do Global Reporting Initiative. Patrícia Pella Fernanda, subgerente de controle de APPs e obras por impostos da Procuradoria-Geral da República do Peru. Andreas Bergman é professor da Universidade de Ciências Aplicadas de Zurique e ex-presidente do Conselho de Normas Internacionais de Contabilidade do Setor Público. Um aplauso para todos, de boas-vindas. Esta sessão vai se centralizar como a transparência e o bom governo podem ser habilitadas e sustentáveis e vamos discutir como uma melhor informação pelos governos
can approach technical issues of decisions related to investments with the private sector. So now I give the floor to Patricia Mackenzie. Well, thank you very much and welcome.
The ability of governments to effectively provide goods and services, to create jobs, and to foster economic growth and development in recent times has been severely constrained by a confluence of factors. There are many factors, but three of them that are important for our discussion today include high debt, limited fiscal space, and inability to access concessional financing. So this is what is at the heart of this conversation of maximizing finance for development. As we all know, in the process of trying to attract private capital flows locally and from foreign markets, there have been a number of bottlenecks or constraints. One of these constraints identified is poor governance and poor transparency in the use and the management of public resources. So today's panel is going to delve into what some of the issues around poor governance and transparency lead to, and possibly to provide some solutions going forward about things that we can all do in both the public and private sectors to enhance this transparency and to promote good governance. Permit me to say a bit about our three speakers. Just to give you a quick flavor, okay? So to my immediate left, we have Andrea Pradilla. Andrea is a lawyer who graduated from Pontificia Universidad Javeriana de Colombia with a specialization in international business law from the Universidad de los Andes and a master's degree in honors in international relations and international development from Georgetown University in the US. Prior to joining the Global Reporting Initiative, Andrea had a number of high-level consulting opportunities. And in 2014, since 2014, she's the director of GRI for Hispanic America based in Bogota, where she promotes corporate sustainability and sustainable development through the drafting of sustainability reports under the GRI methodology, which she will explain to us today. Likewise, she actively supports discussions related to the post-2015 agenda and the role of the private sector in its implementation. Next to her, Andreas Bergman is a professor of public finance, director of the Zurich University of Applied Sciences School of Management and Law in Public Sector. He's a full-time professor and the former chair of the International Public Sector Accounting Board, IPSAS-B, between 2010 and 2015. He's a scientific advisor on PFM reforms to Switzerland, Europe, Central Asia, Latin America. Southeast Asia, and to various international organizations. He holds a diploma from Lancaster University and a master's degree and PhD from St. Gallen University. Finally, to my far left, Patricia Pella Fernandez is Deputy Manager of Public-Private Partnerships and Works at the Contraloría General de la República de Peru. She has 15 years of professional experience advising leaders of Peru's business and industrial networks, as well as public institutions at the national and regional level. Ms. Pella has developed a solid reputation among the multilateral donor community and the Peruvian public sector. In 2016, she was appointed to represent the World Bank for the impact evaluation of the multi-donor fund, which was set up to implement the Lima Metro Line 2 project. Prior to this, she was country representative and speaker at the PPP Business Forum held in Singapore International Water Week in 2014. Ms. Pella holds a MSc in Social Policy and Development from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She also has specialized training received in the UK, Singapore, Brazil, and Costa Rica on law and political science. So, without further ado, I will invite our speakers. Firstly, I will welcome Andrea to address us. Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
To be here. And last time I was here in the Mexico, and it's good to see known faces when we're development. The first thing that comes to mind is always if it's the role of the accounting profession in generating trust in a region. And in this context, I always think what makes us trust some above others. I ask you to think about the person you love the most, your children, your parents. And I give you this scenario. They're very ill. And there are two options. As a physician, I come from a family of physicians. This is the advice I give. You have very limited information. So there's one medication that will save either your couple, your children, your parents. And that medication is only produced by two companies. One company is a Swiss company, and the other company is Chinese. And you know nothing else. And I'll ask you to raise your hand, those who would choose the Swiss company. The Chinese company, nationality is of importance, very important. So you must ask yourself, what does it mean to be a Latin American company? And what do you think about when somebody tells you there's a good or service from a Latin American company? What comes to mind? Someone in Malaysia, when someone says they're going to open a plant in Colombia and in Peru. And it's in this context we're generating trust and sustainable development. Build the imagination regarding the type of region we are, but also regarding the type of region we want to be. So in this context, generation of information on sustainable development, different from generating financial information, is still a baby. It's just being born. How long have we been generating financial information? I would say approximately 100 years, where companies somehow have been generating financial information with information on sustainable development. Sustainability is almost a millennial. It's only 20 years old. So it's young and it's learning. And what is it good for? Well, traditionally, you as an entrepreneur, a director of an organization, make decisions based on financial information. And that's how we would, what we would do in the 80s, or my parents would do it. Cars, automobiles, they only had one side view mirror, and corporate governance information became the other mirror that now delivers the decision maker a comprehensive vision. One of the challenges of generating ESG information is when I say corporate social responsibility or sustainable development, people still think their imagination, philanthropy, charity, donation, the Christmas party. Even more in a culture that is religious and Catholic, like the Latin culture, where it's related to charity. It has nothing to do with charity. ASG information, sustainable development information, does not seek for companies and organizations to think of what to do with their remaining money. If that was the approach, the best presenter of sustainability in my country would be Mr. Pablo Escobar. He was a philanthropist. That's not the discussion today. The discussion is how do we make the money we earn and how this impacts the social, economic environment. And it's in this context where we see that environmental, social, and economic information generated by companies is now being demanded by investors. And why? Well, because it tends to generate more stable investments with greater integrity in the market. Who else is requesting this information? Public policy, the regulators. It comes from the capital and from the regulator. There's public policies in the world that we've been monitoring regarding how information is being, non-financial information is being demanded. And Latin America is a boom. Things we saw in the past, like volunteer, are now becoming mandatory. Definitely consumers, and this is promoted from the market. Consumers are demanding more sustainable products with companies that have capacity to show their purpose. And why this is not just paint a wall green and I could sell. That could have been true 20 years ago, but nowadays consumers are more informed and demand real commitments and genuine commitments with sustainable development. So how is sustainability information produced in ESG topics? Well, as I said, it's still a baby. And in this context, there are standards and frameworks to generate information. In a context where first are the companies that deliver information, the standards, and analysts, and finally data consumers. And it's in this context where the Global Reporting Initiative comes in, the initiative I lead in Latin America, and I was comparing this to financial information. So there's plurality of information standards. At the head, GRI is both, is a framework and a standard, and then there's a global CCLB, and I'm sure that when I'm speaking, there's a new reporting framework being produced. A bit of a panorama of the market, how information is being produced, how is it being audited, and how the information is being used for decision making. And this has been a process in creating GRI standards, which are the most widely used in the world. It started approximately at the end of the 90s, and it's been evolving to include new chapters and responding to the needs of the interest groups. In 2016, we launched the last version of these standards, GRI standards, which respond basically to the possibility for organizations to, in a standardized way, be accountable, but do this in an adjusted way to their operations. And what do I mean with this? Accountability and sustainable development is not to flood the market with the 500 contents. It has to follow a principle that you know well, which is the materiality principle, where I must deliver to the market information that is timely, is significant from our interest groups, and as far as my impacts related to my business core. Very far from the philanthropy ideology. I don't have to deliver information of 500 pages, but the 50 pages I must deliver should contain information containing to my environmental, social, and economic impacts that come from my operation, derived from my operation, as well as material that my interest groups, included but not limited to the investor, the information they require from me to make better decisions. In general terms, the GRI standard nowadays is the most used in the world, and I don't want to go into detail explaining what it's about, but there is a key message for this profession, and the information that is being produced needs to have the same quality standards that a financial information follows, and that's where it's key for the accounting profession to be aware of this role of the assurance it must have in this information. And why do companies do this? Well, as I said a minute ago in a conversation, there's two powerful reasons to do this. The first one is because they believe it's a right way to do business. There's an ethical case linked to being transparent, to have a purpose and wanting to contribute. And the second, if that one's not resolved, is the business case. And there's correlation between improvements in management processes, improvements in attracting and the quality of investors, competitive advantages, better knowledge of the supply chain, improvements in keeping talent, better risk management. So it's a good business to bid for sustainability. But for it to be a good business, I must be able to link my actions and my accountability and sustainability to a good materiality analysis. None of what I show on this slide becomes reality unless I have a solid process to define what environmental, social issues I must report. For instance, if I'm a company in extraction, I must report on indigenous communities. But if I'm a consultancy company in Washington, D.C., I probably don't have to report regarding indigenous communities. So the materiality analysis allows for this to be a reality. And I would like to conclude by saying that for us, what is not measured is not managed, and what is not managed cannot be changed. And when you measure, you open a new path for discussion with public policy. We have observed how the 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development Goals have allowed to create a common language finally between public and private. We agreed on what is the world we want to see in 2030. That was the first part, to agree on the what. Now we have to go down to the how. And now more than ever, we expect for companies to be reporting their contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. Tools exist. Now we have to work from public policy and from the decision makers for that collective effort made in companies to be acknowledged in public policies. And now there are starting to come examples led by Latin America. Latin America was the first region in the world who said we're going to measure between public and private regarding the contribution of the private sector to the Sustainable Development Goals. This effort is called the SDG Corporate Tracker. That's being replicated in Asia with great success, pursuing for the contribution of the public and private sector to be seen as one image, with the purpose of silos when working in development in the private sector on this side and then the public sector and civil society to end up. I would like to leave you with this invitation to rethink what this means in our everyday life regarding what you do with your clients and if the roles in your companies. And I end with this so we can have a discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. And thank you for explaining a bit the global sustainability reporting.
And how this sustainability reporting inspires accountability, because it's also very much front and center of our conversation, accountability for maximizing finance. You've laid out for us some of the elements, how we can identify and manage risks for organizations, and how it could possibly be applicable to the public sector in order to improve overall governance, which could help to crowd in and maximize finance for development. So we're beginning to establish that link, and therefore I move to Patricia Pella Fernandez. She will give us the public sector and the private sector views by reason of her vast experience in both sectors. Welcome, Patricia.
Bom dia a todos, muito obrigada.
Panel. But I also represent the General Comptroller of the Republic of Peru, so it's a privilege and a challenge. And I'll stand to not be out of tone with the other presenters. But I did want to say, especially to the bank
no qual eu saio da
Not only do I leave my professional comfort zone because I come from infrastructure forums for 10 years now, but here we have a bit of everything. We have the comptroller, we have managers, we have GRI, we have the big four. And so my challenge will be for you not only to capture your attention, but also to follow me and especially to be able to connect with the big issues we all face. And each one of the words I say from now until my 9 months I have left. Something I would like to remind you is what was said the first day. The first day, someone spoke, someone I admire very much, Veronica Zavala, and she even said three things, but I'm going to highlight two things she said. I think it's very important. The first one is we must, those who are in challenges, Titanic type challenges, to intervene or try to contribute in closing the infrastructure gap or reducing poverty, which are big words. She said we have to be humble and creative, and this applies to everyone. And we must never forget this. And she said another thing that caught my attention: closing the infrastructure gap. It cannot be done only with public works, and that's where private investment comes in, and that's where we need to create that appetite and that proper scenario for investors to believe in us and to build trust. Yesterday I said the word trust in the panel, and I'll repeat it at least 2 or 3 times if you allow me in these minutes I have left. Basically, what you can see in the slides is not a secret to you. You as SAIs that are here from different countries, and including Costa Rica without a doubt, have many pillars, which are the pillars of the SAIs, and something new, which is related to good governance. And let's see how we bring this concept to earth. And join me in this journey to tell you what we're doing in Peru and what we still must do, and how we can all partner in this common journey. Since Comptroller Schack is controller of the LSF, we have this complex challenge to align incentives, to align interests, and especially strategies. We as a region are very rich in Latin America. I think it's a region that has the most amount of natural resources in the planet. However, we're still caught in certain discussions that don't allow us to take that additional step. Yesterday I recalled, and although I was shocked, when the gentleman from South Korea said education. And 30 years ago, I spoke about education. Now, where is South Korea? To not deviate, I would get excited if I speak about that. This is the background. I'll show it very quickly, but basically what you can see here is the emphasis in improving the governance performance, the principles of the Asunción Declaration, transparency, and accountability. So how do I apply this? What does this all mean for a common citizen that takes 3 hours to commute or to get to work? What does this mean for them? Well, and something interesting that happened in the Santiago Declaration is that besides the fiscal control, which is a typical thing that SAI has to manage properly, it added a contribution to good governance. Wow, and how do we write this challenge? Here we have some numbers of the things we have been doing starting August 2017 when in July 2017, it's about to be a year of the new comptroller's administration. The numbers could be a little overwhelming, but so far it's been over 20,000 control services. And what does this mean, Patricia, as far as impact? That's the key question. How much of that number is really impacting the well-being of the citizens and in good management and the good use of public funds? And that's where I'll share what we're trying to do and the strategies and restructuring we're performing internally in the controller. As you can see there, there's many examples regarding some of the NDGs, and you can see some that are alone, isolated. And I think gender equality is quite solitary there. It's quite isolated. And some other, to end poverty, there are some other elements that are a little in solitary. But there are indirect actions that lead to that. And I'll share a bit how we're doing at the comptroller and what the comptroller Shaq achieved in this, in his role to take us to that partner we want to be with the citizens and with private institutions. Well, I am the one who has to deal day in, day out with these big players who are these gentlemen who have, or women who have these PPP concessions, so the biggest projects in the country. So it's not an easy task. And what we do is that starting last year, we organize different projects where there's millions of people who travel throughout the country to evaluate different aspects. It could be, for instance, projects in schools and solid waste management in the country. And this week, there's a project on how the public hospitals are doing. And this is not done internally. It goes through the press. It has great communication, and whatever reports are generated serve as input. Not always happens, but we're working on this, so it serves as an input for the public managers to use as either an alert or a possible risk to mitigate. So it's a traffic light somehow. So as in transparency, it's very important. We have a portal we're very proud of that is existed for many years. It's called Info Obras is the name of this platform, and it's basically a platform in which all the citizens, common citizens from here in China, can check the main data of public works. So here they can check physical events, financial events, or they can check if the budget was modified. They can check everything they want, and this is great. And if you are 2020 in data, you might say, well, not really. Well, public entities don't complete this information. So we're making all efforts for public entities to fill this properly and for them to complete this. It's a very powerful tool for public managers and without a doubt for the private sector. In Info Obras, we're structuring and reforming in such a way for it to be powerful and especially binding.
Here we have the control reports. This is very important. I mentioned it yesterday in the panel with Juan Carlos Serrano and Pat a little bit earlier today. All of the controllers' reports since 2017 are published, all of them. Before, after PPP or services, works, every unit of the central government and the rest of the country are published. They are going to be monitored by citizens, but also by the media, because of course the press imagine the flagship projects are the mega projects, so this is where the PPPs are engaged. So here is where this really becomes newsworthy, so we really have to be careful about the impact. Something that I noticed studying this topic with the controller team that is based in Lima, we said, well, in Mexico, for the 11 years ago, they were talking about the follow-up and monitoring mechanisms of reports. And what are we doing today in terms of that mechanism? How much of what we recommend state-owned enterprises is actually executed on time, and it's actually done or not? How much value are these SOEs placed on a report of the controller of any other country that says you have no risk, you're doing well, or this is a warranty seal? That should be where we should be going. There is another issue that has caused a little bit of debate but it's being published, the declaration of the goods and income of all the public officers, from the smallest one to the President of the Republic. This is public information, and of course, this has been in the news recently, but it's a challenge that the controller wanted to take, and we are doing it gradually very well. We are also very proud, but I apologize for the ranking, but we have really improved in many positions in the last 2 years. Beyond how difficult this has been, or that maybe suddenly we could be first in the next 2 or 3 years. What is most important is that the efforts that we have been making, what I'm talking about, the operations, the published reports, the open door policy, as I mentioned yesterday in the PPP forum, are adding up to position the controller of Peru along this line. And basically citizens' participation. We have two main sources of participation: complaints of reports that exist everywhere, but we also have a flow and procedure to process these grievance reports so that they can be taken care of on a timely basis and a transparent manner, rather than collect them into a drawer somewhere. And we have citizens monitors. This is interesting. In countries that have geographies that are complex, such as ours, like Colombia, for instance, where they have a mountain range in the middle of the country, how can I learn if there is a corruption or an irregular act has been happening in the small town that is 3 hours by foot from the main airport? Citizens ourselves are creating the mechanisms and incentives for citizens to check how their taxes are being used. So they take pictures and send them to the controller's office. So we have building this trust. So this is basically, here we have what I mentioned before, which is also very important, the public hearing program. The public hearings, as the name says, this is where we go to this farthest away community in the country, and we sit together to listen to them. I have had the privilege of being in Apurima. Apurima is the poorest region in the country. It still has a illiteracy rate beyond 2 digits, just to get an idea. The whole city or town actually doesn't have a single road. Everything is dirt paths, or they have limited access to utilities. So we sat with them, listened to them, and we processed the grievances. And this is also being done at a national level. It requires a huge effort to really listen to them. And of course, we have to manage their expectations very well, because that's a complex item. And the investment climate, there's a little bit of some figures. As you see, the controller is decentralized. We have control offices throughout the country. When we started, I have to say that the gap, what you can see on the column on the left, the 7% that is a gap today, was above 50. So these offices were absent in most of the countries and in the communities, especially in rural communities. It's something that we have to correct. Unless we are there, they will not believe that we will help them. So trust begins with presence, being there. We also have the budgets, that's more figures, more numbers, and local governments take the most part of the pie, because we have 25 regions in the country, and the concurrent model, which is the concurrent control model. As the name says, it's an ongoing control model. It's a model that has two main features. It's non-binding, so that public entities or SOEs decide whether or not they are going to accept or mitigate the recommendations that we give them in terms of risk, and we also support them in their management. I mentioned this yesterday, and I would like to repeat it now, because let's assume that we enter into an agreement for a concession to improve and rehabilitate a port and attract more private investment. Once we sign the concession agreement, the controller activates a concurrent control so that, for instance, to monitor the execution of mandatory investments, to monitor or oversee if the private investor has done its financial closing within the term included in the contract, and during the exploitation phase to check and verify the levels of services, just as an example. So what happens when you detect a risk? We include it in the report, and this is published, as I mentioned, and it is the entity that typically gets close to us and tell us, well, I have an idea or I have a strategy of how to approach these risks. Can we talk about it? And then we do so. The Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of Housing, which is the PP unit in Peru. We are doing it little by little, but we are getting there. So this is what I wanted to share with you. I want to thank you again, and I apologize for taking longer than the assigned time. I hope that you really, I shared with you the points of interest that you expected to listen. Thank you very much once again. Thank you very much, Patricia.
You've given us a really quick sort of like a course in some of the aspects that you've been working on to increase transparency and accountability, and also indirectly to improve public trust and confidence, because that's at the heart of the ability to attract local and cross-border capital flows. One thing that struck me is that your coverage at the national, subnational, and regional levels is quite great. And in the specific area of public investment management, where there's a lot of need for transparency and reduction of corruption, I saw you looked at maybe 70% of the public investment management for 2018 or 2019. So that's a fairly large coverage. So the point is that by looking at such a large part of the public investment management program of the government, whatever your findings are, it kind of increases the confidence that somebody is looking at these large-scale activities. So that's something that I took away from that. So let's look at academia, because our panel is looking at it from 3 different lenses, from the private sector, from the public sector, and now let's look at what Andrea will discuss with us. Some of it he will talk about some of the global trends in accounting and reporting in the public sector, and how these trends are supporting and improving governance. Yeah.
Muchas gracias y otra vez.
To discuss the topics with you. I have already met many of you from prior congresses, but I believe that there have been important developments that need to be discussed. We have already seen in different congresses in the past that the accounting standards have a positive effect in terms of debt. That is, the countries that follow the accounting standards have a lower debt level. Also, it has a positive effect on the interest rates. It is also obvious and for some time now. And the 2 effects are also important for the private sector. Because we have noticed, and yesterday we discussed in the presentations, the morning's presentations, that there is a difficult situation, a difficult fiscal situation in many countries, including the largest ones such as Brazil. And of course, this also affects private companies. If the situation of the debt situation does not allow to make investments in infrastructure, or if the interest rate is too high, then of course, if the interest rate for the government is high, then the interest rate for the private companies is also going to be high, because it refers to the government interest rate. More recently, last year, in fact, there were some other studies that told us that there are other positive effects that have to do with the asset management. It seems that a best asset management, best government asset management can bring about a 3% increase in the GDP, which is much more than the today's deficit in any country in the region. So yesterday we saw that we have a fiscal challenge, but for instance, by managing assets better, we would be able to resolve and close the gap, the fiscal gap that we have in many of the countries in the region. Also, there is also evidence that the fiscal risks are reduced if the international financial standards for the public sector are implemented. So there is a lot of information that we have many positive effects at a macroeconomic level. However, when I was a chair of the IPSAS committee or board, we issued standards about PPPs, public-private partnerships, the IPSAS 32 that requires to disclose a lot of information, and it acknowledges obligations to be included in the balance sheet. At this time, people have said that we are crazy, and second, that we are going to kill PPPs with this standard. But after 10 years using this standard, I have not noticed, or as far as I know, I have not killed any PPPs with these standards. Exactly the opposite. I believe that contracts and their details have improved in order to prevent negative effects on the PPPs, and this can be seen in many countries of this region. We have a country, Peru in particular, where there are many PPPs, and clearly they have improved the contractual conditions as part of this period. Another obvious example is Chile, which is probably the world leader in PPPs, and also it is one of the leading countries in the application of the IPSAS. So even in Chile, there are no negative effects in terms of the PPPs derived from the International Public Sector Accounting Standards. So I believe that at this level or on a microeconomic level, there are also positive effects that we need to notice. And this is the reason why I believe that this is really a requirement or an important task to implement the IPSAS in all countries. Right now, I would like to congratulate 2 additional countries that have been able to do this. Last year, this was the first year for Colombia and Chile using the IPSAS, and I believe that these are 2 very important countries, and that's why I would like to thank all of those who participated in these 2 countries. With this, I am going to give the floor back to you, Patty. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, we have agreed this morning when we were planning this panel that we were going to open the floor for questions to generate a debate, because we know that we can present our opinions and ideas, but you are the ones that really need to go through this, who live this every day. So the question as to the good or poor governance that we have in several of our countries. So for the next 15, 20 minutes, we are going to open the floor for questions geared or targeted for the panel to take advantage of their expertise and experience, and later on I will give some closing remarks and stress some points. So it is 11:45, so if you have questions, raise your hand. Or if you want further details, you're welcome. would like if you can tell us a little bit more about the experience in the 10 years that you mentioned with the application of IPSAS 32. What have been the most significant experiences? Well, if you would like to add later something, I believe that IPSAS 32, the first step requires to involve the accountants in the analysis of the proposal. And I am not talking about the agreement, I'm talking about the proposal, not the contract. And I think that this already has some positive effects. And in fact, today, during the breakfast, I was talking to an accountant from a country that is considering to implement a PPP, and he's involved in the planning phase, in the program phase of the PPP. And we can know what the accounting effects of this would be. And this brings about changes in the proposed contract, because the IPSAS 32 requires recognizing all financial liabilities or intangible and service liabilities in which the government will incur. And this is why we have transparency ahead of time, not just afterwards, but even before signing the contract or agreement. This is why I think this is the most important effect. Of course, we also have effects in the reports. We can see if there are contingencies that are going to be executed because they comply with certain criteria. But this is afterwards, and usually not much can be done after signing the contract, but just paying for our obligations or compliance. That's why I believe that the emphasis on the prior design is so pertinent. To complement your question, in Peru, the way we usually manage the assets belong to the granting entity. If it is a waste treatment plant, so the assets belong to the Ministry of Housing, Construction, and Sanitation, for instance. It is true that still in Peru don't have contracts that have expired or have, but we are getting there in a little while. So this is exactly where we need to apply the standard carefully. And I take advantage to talk about the challenge that we have when we created the specialized unit on PPPs in the Peruvian controller. The typical profile in an FC are the accountants, and this is worldwide. But what happens when we had to audit a PPP? We needed profiles that which much more than multidisciplinary. We needed an economist that knows about project finance to begin with. We needed attorneys that know about private investment. And we also needed engineers, but not only civil engineers, engineers of all kinds, sanitation, electrical, mechanical, and so on. So if you allow me to give you a suggestion, if any of your controller's office, and we have my colleagues of the tribunal, account tribunal, which is a very powerful entity in Brazil, and fearful, we are also like that in Peru, and this is a stigma that we need to overcome and to really become allies after, or partners after building trust. My suggestion is the following. If you are going to audit what we don't know, we are not going to do well. And this is what Controller Shack is constantly repeating in every forum, and and that's why I'm repeating it here. We need to know what we are going to audit. We need to know about the business. That on the one hand. And on the other hand, collecting Andrea Zadia, definitely the asset management is a very delicate issue, because depending on the framework standard in our countries, the state is going to decide if it's going to give in concession that asset or if they go and manage it. So this is why the issue of asset management becomes more relevant, because usually the state isn't necessarily the best manager, especially when we are talking about complex infrastructure. Although they might an investor has built with a local partner, they don't necessarily know how to operate it because it's not their business. That's the reality in most of our countries until we learn over time. I hope that I gave you some additional information about your question. Thank you very much, Patricia. While we wait for the next question. Good morning. My question is for Andrea. We know about that many companies, international companies, are already working on comprehensive reports and on this initiative. But I would like to hear, based on your experience in the region and some other regions as well, how medium-sized companies have been reacting, and even the small company, how are they reacting to these kinds of programs? Because it is a fact that these kinds of companies face very different realities. Some of them just work domestically, others are regionals. They have difficulties to have access to loans. So there are a series of variables that are a little bit different from those that affect international companies. Well, thank you very much for your question. I think that I could talk about one day on sustainable development for SMEs, because that is the question. Latin America is a region of SMEs, and the world economy is moved by SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So within this context, the generation of EF information started with the large companies that were facing scandals in the extractive and industry, and it was migrating to other industries, beginning with the capital market and good practices in more involved markets. And for some years, institutions that promote accountability started thinking as to whether there was an IAS for SMEs, how we could get agreed for SMEs. And with the same challenges for financial information, it has been very complex to keep the quality of the standard, not sacrificing the minimums to make it a standard, but at the same time understanding that we have to include the language of the SMEs. 3.5 years ago, with the supports of the government of Switzerland, we started the program of competitive business for SMEs that was launched in 6 countries, because we wanted to pilot the green SMEs in 3 regions: Africa, South Africa, Ghana, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and in Colombia. We also did it, and in Peru. After 3 years, the project really is only working in Colombia and Peru. Peru being the leader in the generation of ESG information on small and medium enterprises, followed by Colombia with the largest number of small and medium enterprises. And right now in Peru, we have 500 reporting. Many, if you ask me, because it has been a great effort. What have we learned that way? First, the anchor approach. When, as a large company, I go to my supply chain and I understand that indirect impacts are as important in the capture and generation of business value as the direct impacts. And this is an awakening in the region to understand that my impact on the supply chain are under my responsibility, because so far we just got to the limit of the organization. Has made it possible to make the Brexit. So the contents that are reported by SMEs are defined by the client. The client tells them, if you are in the automobile industry, you are going to report A and B, which at the beginning facilitates the process for the SMEs, and it has a direct demand on the client. So this has been an approach that is important. The second one has been to open the space to see what SMEs are ready for the process and to work within the cluster concept, taking advantage of the free trade agreement and the bilateral investment agreements. There are many SMEs in Latin America that are ready to be engaged in the process. And what is interesting and valuable of working with SMEs is that they identify the benefits of the accountability than large companies. So internal maturity has been important. We also work into other areas that are essential, not just important to generate the information, but to really have an enabling environment to have a requirement for this information. First, we work on public policy. When I talk about public policy, I'm not talking from now on it's going to be mandatory to be accountable for small and medium enterprises to report on ESGs. No, we are talking beginning with public procurement to can benefit from the social environments and accountability as an incentive for public policies. And we also work with 3 sectors that require information. The first one is investors. For investors to be aware that the information that is produced by the large company has to include an approach of SME and that they require when they get the information from the large company, the financial sector, so that the location and placement of loans acknowledge and reward the environmental, social, and governance efforts. We work with the media in Europe. The focusing on the small and medium enterprise and the supply chain was measured because of the awareness of the press to turn our views there. And finally, working with the civil society. Why? Because it is important for the civil society to understand if the company, the SME, is providing financial and non-financial information. This should be the baseline for the dialogue. We cannot continue having companies deliver information, large amounts of information, and civil society talking about testimonies. We need to be able to equate the dialogue, so we work based on the demand, the requirements, information production, and public policy. Thank you very much. While we wait, I see some hands raised. But before that, I have a question for Andres before the next. In terms of for accountants, what do you think as a professor? What can we do to accelerate this knowledge of very specific products such as PPPs and others? What can we do as a community to learn faster, to be able to face these changes that are coming in the market? And after that, we will continue with the questions and the floor.
I believe we need to talk about the programs, the study programs of the curriculum, and we begin with universities. As a representative of a university, I believe we have to mention that there are more universities today that are including the public sector, the accounting of the public sector in the course program, and this is a very good trend. But in the case of professional continued education, I believe it's very important to include topics related to the public sector, even the accounting of the public sector. And I believe for this reason, it's something that needs to be adjusted, contemplating the situation in the region. I believe there are some universities and institutes, professional institutes, that are already doing it, and it includes they include many of public issues in their course program. And so in the next revision of course programs may be a good opportunity to include more around this topic. Hi. Good morning. It's my opinion that good governance, more than take into account the strengthening of the control system, should give importance to the strengthening of the administration and accounting systems. Mostly if we want to apply INSP, and I think the Infogras, the IPSAS system, not necessarily having a good control system. Infobras is transparent because it doesn't yield this information. On the other hand, I'd like to ask if it's been possible to determine the relationship between the execution of projects with PPPs and corruption. I see there's a lot of interest in PPPs. So, Patricia, okay, because you didn't give my name, I didn't take it on me. I didn't understand the question, if there was a direct relationship between corruption and PPPs, or corruption in PPPs. What do you mean? The execution of projects done by the government through PPPs has some relationship with corruption in the government. I'm going to answer. I'm a public servant. It's a tricky question. In the country, there's something called lavajato, and many people are aware of this. From a regulatory standpoint, we have Law 3777. What does this law mean? In replacement of others that are still in place, they provided for the procedures for the sale of shares of Odebrecht or its partners from a regulatory standpoint. What does this mean? If there was a concession of a specific entity in the subnational government, and Odebrecht or any one of its executing arms, that you know the names very well, we don't need to elaborate on this. The standard says, okay, so this is how you're going to do it. Step 1, 2, 3, 4. What do I want to say by this? What the Peruvian government said, it's a way to encapsulate this transfer, this money, as an indemnity, if you will. So this is one of the treatments that have been carried out. Another one, and I think it goes along your question, this law has a provision that says provide that the general controllers of Peru will do concurrent control to projects that are on the list where Mr. A, B, and C are mentioned. And the regulation has an appendix to it that responds to a list published at the time by the Ministry of Justice that is in charge of the civil and processes in the attorney's office with the criminal processes. So everything's regulated in Peru. And as I mentioned before, this forces us as EFS or SAI to have the control on this, and not only that, but they're funded. And I can say officially, for instance, the Ministry of Transportation, that evidently is outlier in the execution of infrastructure projects, mostly highways, has formally transferred to the controllers 2% of the investment amount to be executed. All of this is in the standard. If you Google Law 3777, you'll find everything I'm saying. The previous standard, the current one, and how it's been carrying out. And many of the reports that are published on the web, if you enter the keywords of the projects you know as PPPs, the flagship projects in Peru, you're going to find the reports. And you're going to see the results of this concurrent control. So I don't know if this answers your question. I hope it does. Thank you so much, Patricia. We have a question at the back of the room. Can you please speak up so that we can listen better and differentiate a comment from a question? So I wanted to go back to PPPs, but in regards to the measurement in order for it to be transparent for accountability. What's the value of these PPPs in the accounting of the country? And I think the World Pac, IFAC, and all other organizations have a lot to do, and all of the countries have an issue to measure this in the accounting of the country. Basically go beyond the investment amount of the dealer, reflect all of the contingencies, the related liabilities to these PPPs that generate the citizen mistrust, because the true value is not being reflected, or the impact to the accounting of the countries, because we haven't worked on the measurement models. So I'd like to know from Andrea and whoever on the panel, what initiatives are there so that we can beyond the law, because we need to account for it, but how do we measure it? I believe it's true, the measurement of public assets is a challenge. At this moment, the standard SB 32 assumes that the value of the asset corresponds to the value of the liabilities in the sale of the contract, and but it's a project of measurement because it's issued a consulting document to clarify the measurement issue of public assets in this project. However, I believe that what they propose in IPSAS 32 is a prudent option that also includes significant information, although it can be a bit rough, a bit simplistic, this measurement base. Thank you. 2 further questions, and then we're going to begin wrapping up. Thank you for your presentation. In terms of sustainability reports, we're saying that it inspires accountability. In sustainability reports, we were saying that it inspires accountability. And on the other hand, international accounting standards help improve accountability. I wanted to ask you if there's a relationship between the clear reporting and the international accounting standards. In other words, when analyzing an entity, do you take into account whether it uses international accounting standards, for instance, in terms of the quality of information? Within the general standards, it doesn't get into a lot of detail. There are 3 universal standards. In the universal ones, it's expected that the company tells the groups of interest what methodology or standard they use to generate financial and non-financial information. So this is like a first check. Having said this, I don't know if the question is more focused on the integration of both, which may be the main focus, and it's how do I guarantee that I'm not having the 2 mirrors, financial, non-financial, but also to focus halfway through so it integrates information from the 2. And in this regard, technically speaking, one can say that the standards integrate themselves. And in the practice, the way it works is company use GRI standards to generate integrated reports. The problem that I identify, and it's my personal opinion, is that at the end of the day, reports are the result of a process. It happens with the financial, non-financial. So what I see and what I'm saying, and I'm very critical about our companies and movements in this regard, is that we in Latin America, we have combined reports like a collage where I take one thing and the other, because my result cannot be different if my train of thought hasn't changed within the organization. So for me to talk about an integrated process in my decision making, I should have considered environmental, social, and economic criteria. And I think we're just beginning. So not necessarily it's a problem from the standards perspective, but more related to the mindset when making decisions and how this is integrating capital. And in the end, I'm going to have accountability that reflects this mindset. I think regionally, we're lagging behind. Absolutely. I believe the issue is the selection of information. The accounting standards are general, so these are not specific standards for each one of the cases, but they should be applied in the case of IPSAS to all governments globally, and in the case of IFRS to all companies. So they can't be focused on specific issues of a company or a government in particular. And this is why I believe integrated reports are focused later on issues that are pertinent and relevant in the special case, but they need all of the information ready to focus on any part of the information. And that's why it's not contradictory, but complementary. Thank you. I think we have 2 minutes to wrap it up. So the last question to the panel. Confidence and reliability in government is under attack. So if we can do 1 or 2 quick things to raise this trust so that the private sector can enter and bring in their funds and capital, what would the actions be? Beginning from Patricia, because I know you have to leave. I'm saying it, and I'm saying it all the time. For me, public policy has to be bottom up. That's the way it is. In Latin America also, we have a situation of the megalopolis, where at least 3/4 of the population are located on the capital city. So you have to see how you finish the centralization this generates. The inequality in our countries today we have several partners at a multilateral level working endlessly to get to the goal. But if we don't engage the civil society, the people for whom we work, I can be here talking to you, and you can be very concentrated on what you have to do, but we don't work for those that look like us, but those that don't have what we do. So the first thing to build trust is to involve the people that don't have the same baseline we do. The privilege that we have today beyond the stories in the roads of each one of us, we have to engage people. In Peru, and to provide some sort of context, we're discussing the National Infrastructure Plan. And this is an opportunity of public policy that is very important and powerful to tell subnational governments, your voice matters. There's a well-known radio program that's called Your Opinion Matters, and it's very typical of Peru. And I think this is what we have to say, your opinion matters, but to show them this is it. And then the other thing, and it's been discussed throughout the panel as well as yesterday, the word here is standardization in every way. And standardization doesn't mean I'm going to have a straight jacket and not go outside the lines, but I'm going to be as competitive as possible with this minimum level of efficiency and efficacy. But I can be better, and if I detour, I can be better. So these are the messages I wanted to transmit, and thank you for the opportunity. As former president of the Standard Committee, I believe, again, it's the standards, because international standards can be a point of reference, and they don't have an influence on the everyday policy in the country, and that's why this is very important to increase trust. For me, it's stakeholder management 101. It's building stakeholder happens along the process. And this process, you have to show up. Parties have to sit down and acknowledge each other. And there are two big challenges here between public and private. The first one has to do with the terms. Private terms are at a 5 or 10-year term, as opposed to governments to a 1 or 2-year term. And I'm saying this in public policy in the region. Make public policies you're ready to implement once you're ready on the other side. And the 2030 agenda and the SDGs offer an important opportunity to think in the medium term, 2030. And when I'm in the private and I have interactions, private sectors tend to think that the public sector is not connected to them, and all public servants are corrupt. And I've never worked as much when I was a public servant, that all public servants are corrupt and they don't understand the private sector. The private sector has to understand himself as a stakeholder in the action of the public policy. It's a responsibility of the CEO to discuss public policies. And I believe that we have a big gap here between understanding what my lobbying efforts are that are legitimate and what my proposals as citizen and my proposals as city, region, and country. And this is where I depersonalize my interest and think of them within the context where I understand that there can be successful companies in failed societies. Thank you so much. Let's give the panel a big round of applause for your contributions.